secret to winning is constant, consistent management. So we've talked about resistance. Now let's put these into work with patterns. We're going to look at some continuation patterns. We'll start with bases and then branch out from there. Now, as we look at continuation patterns, there's a lot of different types of bullish breakout patterns. The whole idea is to create a picture, a framework to work off of. Excuse me. The really good thing about technical analysis is that we can quantify our actions. We can quantify, well, here is resistance, and here's the breakout point, and here's where our corresponding stop loss should be, and here's how much we can target. We can quantify the numbers and make good risk to rewards. So we want to be able to identify these patterns. Base patterns, where you create relatively equal highs and lows. Cup and handles, where you create a deeper cup with a more shallow handle. Ascending triangles, stalling at the same resistance but rising lows, showing that the buyers are pushing higher but the sellers continue to hold. Symmetrical triangles, true indecision, what they call a volatility crush, where they compress the volatility down, lower highs and higher lows. We're going to look at each of these patterns. We're going to start with the bases. There's a couple of different types of bases. We're just going to start with the standard, which is more of a sideways pivoting back and forth. So it's like a trading range. You just keep bouncing between two price points. And there's pivot points. So resistance is up here around 32. Support is down there around 30. And it's in that ballpark, right? It's not an exact number, but it's in that range. That is a sideways base. You can quite clearly see an extreme bullish breakout. Look at the size of that big bullish candle. Look at the acceleration up and through. We have increased volume when it did it. I mean, the characteristics behind that breakout are fantastic. And then you can see the upward results that followed. That's one style of base. This one's similar to that. See how we pivot back and forth between two price points? That's a form of a base. The next type of base is what we call a high base pattern. The difference between just your typical base and a high base is a high base will usually have candles that stack side by side. So instead of going up for 3 or 4 days and then pivoting and turning down and having a more pronounced big trading range to create a base, a high base is very narrow, and it's just mostly 1 or 2 candles stacked next to each other that just kind of base sideways. See how all these candles are compressed? This one's really drawn out. Usually it'll be maybe 5 candles, 6 candles, something like that. You know, you just go sideways, you stack them up for a handful of days, and then finally break out and accelerate. High base, you can see it's just more kind of sideways day-to-day price action. Not really bouncing us, but just all the candles stacked sideways, followed by the breakout. So we call that a high base as opposed to just your typical basing, you know, sideways choppy price action. High base patterns are one of the most bullish considerations after a strong run. So if you run higher and then all the sellers are able to muster is they can get the stock to go sideways for 5 or 6 days, it tells you that stock just wants to go higher still. You see this high base formation and you know it's a bullish candidate for a nice upside breakout. So watch for those high bases. You'll see here, I would argue the first one I would call more of just your typical base because you have more of kind of the pivoting back and forth, right? The back and forth price action. But this one, just a high base with sideways candles and then the breakout. Either way, a couple of basing patterns that were certainly reasonable for buy points. And where do we buy? We buy when we clear resistance. We'll talk about that 2 weeks from now when we talk about trading triggers and stop loss placement and all of that. That's basically your entry point, is on the other side of resistance. So basing patterns, remember, more of the back and forth as opposed to the high base, just a nice narrow range. Essentially, you're dragging lines between the top and the bottom end of the range.